Talk to me. Oh God, it's the remake Freddy. Blow out the candle, blow out the candle. What's going on, everybody, and welcome to my review of the new A24 horror film, Talk to Me. And this has been one of the more hyped up horror films thus far in 2023. It is apparently made by a couple of YouTubers, a couple of brothers. I'm not familiar with their channel, but they have a pretty large following. And so for many different reasons, YouTubers coming into Hollywood, the hype, the pretty mediocre year of horror preceding the release of this movie, I've been very interested to see how good this thing actually is. Now, I walked into this movie blind. I did not watch a trailer. I didn't read a plot synopsis. I knew barely anything about it, just based off of images that I've seen shared with a chick with black eyes and her head cocked to the side. Of course, I've seen the image of the little ceramic hand. I knew it had something to do with spirits and possession, but that's about where my knowledge ended. And to offer you the same chance to walk into this blind, which is absolutely the way to watch a movie like this, all I will tell you about the plot is that essentially you have a group of teenagers in Australia that play around with possession for a party game. Starting right off with the positives, as somebody that has been incredibly burnt out and just sick and tired of demonic possessions and even haunted house movies to a certain degree, because we've gotten so many of them over the last number of years and most of them have been pretty mediocre, this is probably the most unique spin I've seen on that subgenre in a very long time, maybe ever. This subgenre tends to be filled with so many tropes and cliches and familiar directions, and even thematically very familiar with each other, that it's just very rare you find a movie that's able to explore the spirit world and possessions and all the things that this movie is going after in a way that you have not seen it done. And that's always really impressive to me. Those are the types of movies that I walk away remembering in a year past. These are the types of movies that I'd recommend to people that are equally as burnt out as me or watch as many horror films as me, because just not often you get a movie that gives you a rewarding experience like that, where you don't know everything that's going to happen and you see things done in a different way. Beyond that, the movie is very well directed by these two twins. There is a lot of genuine tension and genuine atmosphere that is built. They do some really interesting things visually as far as kind of bleeding our world into the spiritual world a little bit. There's some really nice transitions and a couple of shots like where somebody's laying down and then suddenly they just walk away and they're standing upright. And what I appreciated about the way that they unfold their story is that they actually give a lot of credit to the audience to figure some things out. I actually walked away from the movie slightly frustrated at a couple of things that I was unclear on, and then just sitting and thinking about it and sifting through some of the info in my head, I was able to come to a bit more of a clear conclusion. And where sometimes that will frustrate me if I don't feel like I'm given enough info to actually do that on my own, this is one of those times where they don't spell everything out 100%. They don't give you all the clear parameters and rules for how their exploration of these things is different from all the other movies. You kind of just have to go along for the ride and then take the little bit of info that you're given and fill out the rest of the blanks. And what that does is it creates a little bit of this uneasy tone while you're watching it, because you don't see all these cliched rules spelled out in front of you. You don't see all these parameters that you already know from other films of, okay, well, we can only do this, this can only happen, so the movie's obviously gonna go down this track narratively. Performance-wise, everybody does a good job. Sophie Wilde is the lead here. She has a lot more to carry than all the other characters for the most part, and she definitely holds her own. She's somebody who's capable of guiding us through this story and giving a lot of different emotions as things get crazier and more emotional as it goes on. And a lot of the physical performances with the different actors was very convincing whenever you have the possession scenes going on, because movements matter a hell of a lot more than voice, because you can always modulate voice, you can always add some bass and throw some creepy sounds into there, but if somebody's not moving really creepily and doing some very unnatural things with their body during possession sequences, it's not as convincing, and this is one of the more convincing examples. Joe Bird, especially, of all the characters that have a sequence of being possessed, does the best. It's one of the most gripping, one of the most disturbing for sure, possession performances that I've ever seen, and something that really aids into that, not only Joe Bird specifically, but a lot of the other things this movie has in store for you, is the really impressive practical effects. Now, you guys know I love practical effects. I preach it all the time. I can't stand overuse of CGI in horror films. Not only does it make the horror and the violence just so much more visceral, but even just the more subtle horror here with lights turning on and off, or something appearing in the shadows, or something being in the corner of the shot that you didn't notice until it starts to move. All of that real, not a computer doing the work. And for a horror film especially, that is so integral to the experience because it blurs that line between fiction and reality. When you're watching something that is tangible things in camera, people, effects, rubber, blood, not digitized bullshit, it makes you that much more sucked into the story, that much more convinced that what you're watching is actually happening. And finally, I appreciated the fact that the movie had a little bit of an undercurrent of a message talking about grief and how living in grief and not moving on can kind of open you up to some bad elements in life potentially, and it's manifested in probably the worst and most horrifying way within this story. But anytime there's a little extra brewing under the surface that's there if you want it, and you can easily skip past it if you don't want to find it, that's good commentary in my mind. Now moving on to the negatives, I really have only 2 gripes with this movie, and they're not really all that sizable. One of them might actually go away when I rewatch this film. But the first one, I found it to be incredibly overhyped how scary this movie is. Now that's not this movie's fault. My genuine critique is just that it's not all that scary. It's much more of a disturbing movie, maybe a little bit more uneasy of a watch than I would say a scary movie. Like, I tend to not get scared by too many horror films. There's maybe on one hand, I can count how many in my entire life have genuinely made me uneasy after I've watched it, to where I feel like whatever was in the movie is actually in the dark later on that night. This is just not one of those films for me. There was never a point where I was really gripping my seat, or you do that thing where something creepy happens and your eyes stay open and you're just afraid to blink because you just know something's going to happen. I didn't quite have that experience with Talk to Me, so I would say that just to manage everybody's expectations. So many reactions that I've seen, scariest movie ever, scariest movie I've seen in years, scariest movie since Hereditary, I saw like 5 different times, saw one just today that even celebrated the fact that it was pull quoted by the movie and said one of the scariest movies in existence. Stop the pull quote game, please. And you know, we're all different. What scares me isn't what's going to scare you, so there might be some elements here that genuinely do get under certain audience members' skin. Just for me personally, this is not a movie that at any point I would say is one of the scariest movies that I've seen in a long time. I can think of 2 in recent memory that were a little creepier for me than this one. And the other negative, while I applauded the fact that this movie doesn't over-explain its rules and its lore, and they have the confidence that the audience members can figure it out, there's a bit too much confusion in the last 10 minutes for me. There's a lot of things where you don't quite know people's motivations, you don't quite know what the answer to certain things are, and the movie is just really fast in its final moments, and so you kind of get left with the credits going, okay, there's about 3 or 4 questions I need answered to completely understand that ending. I look forward to eventually rewatching this and hopefully picking up some breadcrumbs in the first 2 acts, or maybe a couple lines of dialogue that ties into things that happens, and hopefully I get the answers to those questions to get a definitive answer out of what the ending was exactly conveying. But it is one of those endings that is going to divide a few people, where one person's going to see it one way and one person's going to see it another way. And it's not one of those like thematic things where it's like, how did you interpret that image? It's more so of like, okay, with the little information that you had, what was your hypothesis by the end? And I lied because there's one more thing I got to point out. This was just a tiny issue. Luckily, it wasn't something that was all throughout the film, but in the first 2 acts, like especially in some of the party scenes where there's a lot of music and noise going on, the speed at which some of these characters' dialect was moving, as well as the Australian accent, because this is an Australian horror film, made some conversations a bit hard for me to hear completely. Between this and Oppenheimer, I feel like I need to get a hearing test at this point, but just a couple lines, couple conversations in there that I did struggle to hear completely. Again, will probably go away on a rewatch. But overall, guys, this is one of the more original horror films that I've seen in a very long time. Certainly one of the best of the year. I don't know if I'm ready to crown it the best quite yet, but it's possible. Really enjoyed it. Very disturbing and interesting and unique with the ways that it explores a very familiar territory. and by the end of it, it's absolutely a must-watch if you are a horror fan. That's it for this one, guys. If you enjoyed that, please click over here for all my 2023 new release reviews so far, and I'm also going to put my review for Cobweb, the other horror film that came out over the past week that not many people are talking about. Like, share, and hit that subscribe button so you don't miss everything in the future, and as always, remember, opinions are like assholes, but that doesn't mean you have to be.